All right, welcome to today's Community of Practice meeting. It's our first Community of Practice meeting for supporting students with IEPs during COVID-19. My name is Daniel Parker. I'm an Assistant Director of Special Education at DPI. We have Eva Kabinski and Alicia Reinhard presenting an overview of our forward guidance, specifically around the special education section. And then we have Nico Micknock and Anita Castro, two of our procedural compliance consultants, also assisting with some of the discussion today in our webinar. We'd like to thank the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, or WISPE, for providing us the Zoom platform for today's webinar. WISPE's mission is to develop strong relationships and build effective partnerships, and they have family engagement coordinators throughout the state, supporting partnerships between families and educators. And again, we just want to thank them for supporting us during this webinar, and some of the WISPE folks who joined in to help us with that family perspective as we navigate these new waters we're in. The purpose of our calls for the community of practice is to provide information and guidance to you, the community practice members. We want to share some of the most up-to-date information that we have at the department or that is coming out nationally. But we also want you all to share your ideas and your resources with each other and with us so that we can all learn together. We want to collaborate around topics that are happening right now as we return to school and come back this school year. And upcoming topics for these community of practice meetings will depend on the questions that you have, on the chats, and some surveys that we'll be sending out. So as we come back, we just want to remind everyone of our equity focus here at the Department of Public Instruction and across the state of Wisconsin. And that educational equity means that every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, ability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income. In addition, as we return to school, we know this is a really difficult time. We know this personally. Those of you who have families, those of you who are teachers thinking about health and safety returning to school. We know that this from our loved ones and friends. We know this from the media. This is a hard time that we're all experiencing. And during hard times, equity cannot be more important. We need to make sure that we're thinking of our most marginalized students and family, our students of color, our students with IEPs who have the most significant needs, and making sure that they have the same opportunities as other students during this time. We need to take this time to maintain and deepen relationships. There's nothing more important than relationships right now with each other, taking care of ourselves and taking care of our students and families. We need to collaborate in decision-making on individual student and family needs. You're going to hear that individualized decision-making a lot today. And we need to increase the capacity of families and general education teachers to maximize that least restrictive environment so that we're all able to support our students with IEPs. And again, I mentioned earlier, but we need to practice that self-care so that we can support others. Now I'm going to hand it off to Nico Micknock, who's going to talk a little bit about the Equity Decision and Policy Tool and why that is important for us as educators right now.
Hi, everyone. As Daniel mentioned, my name is Nico Micknock. I do see that we're still showing the poll results, and I know some people mentioned that it's kind of blocking their screen. We can maybe stop sharing those results, or you can just drag it to the side, I believe, or maybe even just kind of close it or throw an X on it. And you should be able to see the screen. So I'm a consultant on the special education team. I'll also mention that we just had a baby, so if you hear some screaming in the background, that is a baby, not an adult, and that should put you at ease, I would hope. Maybe the baby will even make an appearance here in a little bit. But at any rate, I'm actually on paternity leave right now, and DPI is very flexible with paternity leave. They're not making me work right now. I chose to come and do a little bit of this presentation because I think it's really important. You know, as Daniel mentioned, you're all leaders, and times are really crazy right now. I've even been kind of chatting with some friends in the chat here privately, and just kind of talking about all how quickly things are moving along, and how many decisions are having to be made on a daily basis. And so what I wanted to do today actually is share with you something that we have at DPI that was developed for DPI, but I think people can take different parts of this tool and use it broadly within your own district. And I'll kind of give you sort of an overview of what it looks like, and then I'm just going to highlight a few points that I would like to encourage you to kind of keep in mind as in the coming months, especially as you're making so many decisions that are just new and unfamiliar for you and your district. And in the poll, I saw a lot of you are in sort of policy making decisions, but really we all make decisions all the time that can have an impact on equity. And sometimes they're big P policy decisions, and sometimes they're lowercase p policy decisions. But especially right now, I think a lot of you are in situations where you're having to make decisions that I think keeping equity in the forefront as you're making those decisions right now is really important. So this was a tool, as I mentioned, that was developed for people at DPI. And if you walk around DPI, you in kind of peak, we all work in these little cubicles in a stylish sort of bureaucratic blue hue to all the office furniture. If you walk around, you'll see these little printouts of this tool that I'm about to share with you pinned to people's cubes throughout the building. And I think that's because a lot of people have found that this tool very useful and have really bought into it a lot. And I'm one of those people, which is why I'm here sharing it with you today. So just to kind of give you an overview, there's sort of 3 cards that all go together in this equity decision and policy tool. This is the first card here, which kind of talks about how you and your own personal interactions can advance equity. On the next slide, you're going to see the sort of the meat of the decision and policy tool. And what I'm going to do is kind of pull out a couple of pieces of this to talk about here in a moment. But this is sort of the meat of the tool, and then this third slide is the third card, which is the instructions of how to use the tool. And so on the next slide is kind of where I've highlighted the things that I think are really important, and these are the ones that I often think about in my own work and want to encourage you to think about as you move this work forward. The first one is it's sort of a self-reflective question. What are the intentional and unintentional consequences of educational equity that could result from this decision? And I want to highlight a couple things there. As Daniel mentioned, right now many of you, if not all of you, are in a position where you're really working with underserved populations of students that often bear the brunt of the unintended consequences of decisions that are made. And I know right now there's decisions that are very difficult to be made. What's baked into this reflection, and when you make a decision, you can kind of think about the unintended consequences of a decision. But what's of course baked into this question here is that you're reflecting on a decision after it's made. And I think that's really important, that you take sort of this iterative approach to the decisions that are happening, and that's because circumstances are constantly changing right now. So I think it's important to reflect on decisions that you've made based on changing circumstances, but also that's a good opportunity to look at a decision and really ask yourself, are there unintended consequences of this decision 2 weeks in, 4 weeks in? How is this playing out? A lot of the questions are kind of around virtual learning and face masks right now. But people are going to have to make decisions with the best information that they have at the time that they make that decision. And people are going to make mistakes, or I don't want to say mistakes, but there's going to be decisions that you look at a few weeks down the road, and you're going to reflect on this and say, maybe there was a better decision, or maybe in light of these changed circumstances or in light of this changed information, we need to revisit that decision. And I think that's going to be really important moving forward, to be flexible in your thinking and in your decision making, to look at something and say, this is not what we wanted to happen with this approach that we're taking, let's say to virtual learning or what have you, because especially for students with disabilities, you're going to look at situations and decisions that could impact things, even from a compliance perspective, like least restrictive environment, whether or not a student's receiving FAPE, but also just from a good policy perspective, you want to look at that and ask yourselves, is this what we expected to result from this decision? So that's that's sort of the first question that I would challenge you to keep in the forefront of your mind as you move forward. The other piece of that too, of course, is that right now, sort of a lot of the messaging coming from DPI is focused around equity. It's also focused around flexibility for school districts. We know this is hard for you right now, and we're trying to find every flexibility that we can so that you can make good decisions for your students. Of course, with great flexibility comes great responsibility to make sure that a lot of the constraints that are built in that are now you're finding some flexibility around, those constraints are built in for a good reason. And you just want to make sure that as you're moving forward, and maybe being able to kind of have some flexibility with that you're not kind of going off the rails in one direction or another for any particular subgroup of students, and especially the students that you work with, students with disabilities. So the next sort of self-reflective question that I would encourage you to look at as you're making decisions is, whether or not you've engaged stakeholders, or really the way I like to think about this question is who's at the table when we're making this decision, whose voice has been heard and whose voice has not yet been heard, and who's going to be impacted by this decision. And I think reflecting on that as you're making all these decisions in the coming months, or maybe this entire school year is going to be full of these decisions that you're going to have to make, it's important to always ask yourself that question, and I think it's going to lead to better decisions and better outcomes. And so this next bullet is actually from kind of the instructions or the purpose of the tool, but it's really to ensure that all learners benefit from the policies, programs, and decisions that you make. And then on the next slide, I want to highlight one other thing that kind of ties back to the first bullet point that I was talking about. I've put in these little green arrows on this slide, just highlighting everywhere it talks about these decisions being based on data. And I think that's a really good way to obviously make decisions, but also to reflect on decisions. So when we talked about reflecting on whether or not there's been some unintended consequences to the decisions that you're making, and as you're learning from those decisions, it's going to be important to think about what data you need to be monitoring and looking at, and making sure you're collecting that in a way so that when you want to reflect on the outcomes of any particular policy decision that you're going to be making, you can look at that and say, okay, here's the data that we can look at to decide whether or not this decision has brought what we wanted for our students and for our staff and for our community. So that's really sort of our equity decision and policy tool in a nutshell, but it is something that I've found very helpful in my work, and I hope that you can take some pieces of it at least and incorporate it into your work. It gives me a lot of peace of mind when making difficult decisions to use this and think about it, and like I said, there's going to be decisions that are just difficult to make, either because you don't have all the information or just because the nature of those decisions are really difficult, and that's okay. I feel always good about it because I tell myself, if I'm making this decision and we're making sure we're looking at it, a few weeks down the road or a few months down the road, and we're asking ourselves these questions, then we should feel good about moving forward with the decision, and it kind of gives you some peace of mind. Helps you settle into that decision that you've made, especially the tough ones. So that's all I had on this. So if we go to the next slide, I think that is going to be Eva. Is that
yes?
Eva's going to pick up this slide.
Thank you, Nico.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that.